Welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I want to talk about the placement of Pluto in the ninth house. Pluto is an extremal sense of self. It is extremal because it has to do with the connections that we humans have to the core. And what I call the core is the core of existence itself, the nucleus from which all else is coming out. It's a core because if it is foundational, then it has to be at the very origin of everything. So you can imagine the central point of a sphere in some sense, okay? But I'm using the term figuratively, alright? Good analogy is the core of a black hole, which is the singularity. Now, according to mathematics, it's a mathematical point. So what does it look like in physical reality? Well, no one knows because of a postulate in physics that says that all such singularities are hidden behind event horizons. So you cannot have a naked singularity. Why? Because the singularity itself is a mathematical point, and once you see it, then everything becomes obvious to you. Your existence is mathematics. Okay? Well, in the human form, Pluto is what that thing represents, the aspect of reality that behaves like that. It tends to be hidden behind a veil of secrecy, or a veil of what you would call impenetrability. It's why mythologically Pluto is said to be equal to Hades, like with a type of reality that is subterranean in the underworld, so to speak, meaning that it is very far from the conscious mind, just like how Pluto is far from the sun. Okay, the general idea is to convey to you that you're dealing with an aspect of self that is very, very old, very primitive in a sense. Okay, but that's not really what it is. I mean, it's like saying that when you're coming from another star system and coming into the solar system, and when you meet Pluto, then that becomes a very primitive. No, it's like the airport you land in. You know, I have this thing I normally say that on your natal chart, what is really born on the ascendant for everybody, doesn't matter what sign is rising there, what is really born for everybody is Scorpio and Pluto. It's just that it takes human beings about a couple of years, to develop their sexual selves. And so you have to go from Aries to Scorpio. That's what Aries to Scorpio is like. It's like a period of development where the human self is developing into their sexual self. And that takes time. It takes time really to be good at it. And usually that tends to coincide with when we're ready to have things like life partners. We must understand the nature of this core and the connection to it, the sexuality that it connotes. Why? Because if you don't know what it is, you will see it in the most fearful, frightening, and horrific way that you can. Why? Because since it is what arises on the ascendant, it represents the deepest of our motives. Take, for instance, sexuality is a very powerful force, not just in human beings, but in nature. And people tend to do all sorts of things where sex is concerned. People fight because of that. Not just people, but in the animal kingdom also. When a female deer, for instance, goes into season, all the males, they go berserk, And in human nature, you also have examples of that, where human beings create a system of power and hierarchies. Well, that's how they are interpreting this thing called sex. But sex is just a word. Underline it, what does it mean? It means a depth, a connection, alright? A connection to an orgasm. Well, what is the orgasm? If you've been listening to my podcast, you realize that the orgasm is a point of knowing, like the point of deepest knowing, where you touch something. You don't really know what you touch, but what you do know about it is that it is something that you want to return to over and over again. But what you touch really is a memory of paradise. That's what it really is. But since we don't remember what paradise is, because we're human beings, physical human beings now, then we tend to attach to it the deepest feeling that we can. And that's what that orgasm is. And besides the point of orgasm itself, which doesn't last, which is like a torment for human beings, because we get to taste something for a few seconds, and something that is the bulk of our existence, really, the bulk of our reality. And yet we can't have it. And so it means that we come back to it over and over and over again. And that is now used to generate the continuity of life. Okay? But what it is a connection to a knowing of some kind, a knowledge, an awareness of something that is no longer in human awareness as physical beings, right? Now, I'm not saying that physicality and spirituality are different things. They're not really. They're just changes in perspective. And when I say changes, I'm talking about the amount of knowing that is contained in the perspective. For instance, what you call physical reality means that there's so many gaps in the knowledge space that you cannot connect with because you don't even know that they exist. Spirituality is the process of becoming very aware of these connections because they run into everything. They're everything. And I've detailed the nature of these connections mathematically. And I've used that detail to construct many proofs of so many of the open conjectures in number theory. You can go look at them on my website. I publish them on Zenodo, but you can have links to all the papers and all the whatever through my website, Because the point is that what I'm talking about is not just fairy tale. I'm not just making these things up. These things are real. What you call a spiritual universe or a spiritual world is a sensitivity to the connections that are not obvious. But they're there. They've always been there. Okay? So you can think of it as the difference between spiritual reality and physical reality is a density of awareness, a density of meaning. Okay? So in that sense, there's no real difference between the spiritual universe and the physical universe. There's no such thing as physical or spiritual. There is only the human perspective that tends to see physicality. And then as that sense of physicality deepens with the connections and the awareness of them, that physicality begins to become spiritual. Now, you can imagine that this process goes on to the point where you are seeing physicality as something full of all these connections. And then the universe is very different in front of your eyes. Pluto is that need to know what this is. Now, I said, I've written about the connections in a way that, I've spoken about them informally like I do on my podcast. But I've also written about them in a way that is purely mathematical. And the reason for that is because, my target audience is not just people who I can speak to informally. My target audience is also those who, are in the business of knowing. And where better than in mathematics? It's the thing that underpins or underlies the entire modern world of science and technology. Yeah. So I had to demonstrate the connections there so that you can see the origin of those connections, where it is coming up. Because what I'm showing you is the mathematical form of the core. That's really what it is. Okay. Now, when I say the mathematical form, it's really a tautology because it implies that there is a form and then there is a mathematical description of it. That's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I am showing you the mathematical form of a mathematical core because you're mathematics. Doesn't matter what you think about it. Your universe around you is mathematics. It's not that mathematics is used to describe it. No, it is mathematics. Okay. You are mathematics. You're literally the conspiracy that exists between numbers. But you don't know. So what I've been trying to do is to point out what this conspiracy is and to show you precisely what it is so that you can question it. Okay? Because that's what it means to awaken. To awaken is not to awaken into some new political philosophy or to awaken into some new religion. That's not what it is. Even though a lot of people tend to think that that is what it is. But it has nothing to do with that. To awaken is to awaken into the one truth. The truth that is pristine forever. It doesn't change. It doesn't move. It doesn't vibrate. It doesn't go off and on. It is consistent and constant. Okay? That one truth is the core. Now, in human nature, this tendency to be connected, because you never leave the core, even when you're physically human, you're still connected to it. You come from it. Alright? The core is the truth of all arithmetic, all knowledge, all awareness. It's just what it is, right? You grow out of it, like a crystal growing out of another crystal in some sense. Okay? Now, your connection to that core, it is envisaged as the coming into the solar system process. Because you see the sun as the central focus of your awareness. And then you're coming into the star system that the sun rules. And then you begin to meet the outer bodies, the remnants that were forgotten from the construction of the solar system. They form the Earth cloud. And then you get into a region where you now meet Pluto. Okay, Pluto used to be a planet, but astrologically it never stopped being a planet. Because astrologically, what it represents, even though it represents every ice body in that region, right? It's not about the Pluto itself. It's about that region surrounding our star, where self-awareness is in its earliest stages of becoming the solar focus that we now see with the sun. You see? So that's the way to look at it. It is a connection to the rest of everything else in the universe. Because our sun is not just singular. It belongs to a group. And the group eventually organizes itself into a galaxy. Couple of 100 billion stars. Well, each one is a consciousness point. So what we're describing here astrologically is the way that our own consciousness point crescendos to the peak of the sun. But it starts off from a part where we're not really aware of ourselves. And this is where the Plutonic forces, they reside. Do you understand? It's very primitive and very deep. But what it is that it is the need, the obsessive need to know what we are, to know what existence really is. Okay? Because even though it seems like we are a blank slate, it's not exactly true. We have memories, but we don't know what they are, or we cannot retrieve them. But when we come into contact that somehow reminds us of that depth, it draws out a very strong reaction from us. And that is what happens when you come into the presence of someone that you are strongly and very deeply attracted to. You don't even know why. You don't even know why. And before you come into the presence of that person, you still feel, if you're born with significant Scorpio placements or Pluto placements, etc., you still feel the pull to that core. And you don't know what it is. It just manifests as a very strong sexual appetite or libido. And it's not the energy for sex per se, because that is very Martian. It is the connectivity of that deep sex. But it's not about sex, like I've said. It's about knowledge. So Pluto represents that connection to this foundational, primordial knowledge of self that is hidden behind a type of barrier. And every time you look at it, it draws out some type of strong reactions from you. Very sexual, deeply sexual. And because of that, it compels and obsesses you to act in several ways. Ways that can turn out to be what? Dangerous. Why? Because people fight each other over sex. Because in order to make the battle of sex even more complicated, people invented money. And so the Plutonic forces tend to deal with these depths of connections to power and money and sex and how they're used. And usually these things, they are the ingredients for every atrocity that you find in the world. Now, what it is really is just a reinterpretation of the core. And it is coming from the fact that people don't understand what the core is. Why? Because people have been conditioned into weird states of consciousness regarding the nature of sex. And when you're not allowed to do something simple, like how something is made, then you end up doing something very, very complicated. So what happens is people's desires begin to investigate very many different types of stories, all revolving around this need to know. But now the need to know is shielded behind some type of barrier where the mind cannot penetrate through it. And so it comes out as the desires, strong desires for sex, desires for money, desire for power. Okay? That's how it manifests. Actually, it actually manifests as the desire for sex. And that now branches into the desire for power or the desire for money. Because both are literally sort of like the same thing. You see? But I've said what it is that it's looking at the core and then being frightened about it. Why? Because what it reminds you of is not something that you can accept. There is something in the natal chart, or there's something in the personality that is blocking the ability to accept that thing, because it's a narrative about the self. So the individual creates the opposite, denial. And so these machinations into the area of money and power and all that, they are the ways in which the individual is pursuing the denial of that Pluto so as to block it out of their conscious experience. The origin is always a corruption in the sexual narrative. It is the corruption itself that creates the tendency towards obsession. And then addiction are the behavioral patterns that revolve around that obsession. And that's how it is. That's how it holds a person in a stronghold. It's not done consciously. So it's not something that you can say, okay, today I'm going to use my mind and my self-consciousness to break it. No. Even though the sun is still the denizen of the entire solar system, by the time you get to the orbits of Pluto and the Plutonic or extra-Plutonic forces, or the comets or whatever, because that's a region where you have a lot of comets, those now become unconscious drives, usually tending towards great obsessions. Because the sun is weaker there, the radiation of the sun, everything exists in a state of dimness of some kind. But what is the challenge? The challenge is that the core is the most beautiful thing in known existence. It's the most beautiful thing anything can know, or anyone can know. So why does it look this way? Why does it appear so frightening? I mean, if you look into nature, for instance, the way the animals interpret the core, it's very bashful. It's completely crazy in some sense, in the sense that there's so much, what appears to be so much violence in the animal kingdom. But it's not really. Why? Because they're not self-aware. They have no idea of anything that is going on in there. Because there's no self in there. And that is by design. You see, because the moment a self exists, it needs to come out of that type of environment. Why? Because the self, the nature of what it is, it can't sit that thing. Because being a self means that you are primed for beauty. It means that you now have the equipment to be able to see the core for what it really is. And that means seeing the beauty behind it. And so human beings are predestined to seek the deepest, most beautiful and most truthful love stories. And I've said earlier that from this fate, nobody is exempt. It's the natural tendency of what it means to be a self. So when you say a self, that's exactly what you're describing. So you can't really sit the opposite. People try, and there's a lot of attempts. Look at the world. But what happens is that they create denials around all those things so as to be able to pretend to sit it. And so their sitting always rests on these denials. But these denials, they're not worth anything because they have no conviction within them. Because you can't change what you are. You can't change who God is. You can't change anything really. You're just here to observe what it is and to tell stories about what you're observing. So ultimately, the fate of all these denials is to crumble into nothing. And then truth is always there. It's not like truth is being revealed. It didn't go anywhere. It's just that the consciousness was no longer equipped to be able to handle or to accept what it is. And so Pluto is that thing that we as human beings, we get to accept as part of ourselves once we have learned to understand what it is. In the meantime, prior to that, we're running away from it. We're hiding it. Is the thing that nobody talks about at a dinner table. Whatever that is. Well, that's a Plutonic thing. It's the thing that society ignores because facing it brings up all sorts of issues. And the issues revolve around things that are coming up from the depth. It makes people frightened. Makes people very, very nervous and anxious. Okay? And that's why astrologically Pluto is said to be the lord of the underworld in some sense. No part of you wants to... There's no such thing as an underworld. Let's put it that way. There's no such thing as an underworld. Alright? So what you're trying to do is you want to be able to accept this part of yourself and elevate it into the light. But it always has to do with something that is very, very true. So true that it's frightening. So Pluto involves confronting your own truth, the deepest part of your own truth. Okay? So it always exists in a minimum of two stages. There is the stage where the human being is running away from this. And there are the period of transformations that occur. And each one looks different in different people's lives. You alright? That transformation now reconciles you somehow with your own truth. And you begin to live a more authentic life. You may even get to the point where this truth of yours, you wonder how you've ignored it for so long because it's the most beautiful thing that you know. It truly is your power. It's not figurative speech or something like that. No, it really is truly your power. Because it's not a power that is given to you or something. It's a power that comes from recognizing the truth. The steadiness of the truth. The fact that you don't need to devote resources towards maintaining the denials. It frees up a lot. So it allows you to even be more productive. But usually it comes after a period of transformation. Wherever you have Pluto in your natal chart is where you are going to experience a transformation. And the reality around you is going to be transformed because of that experience. The 9th house is the post-orgasmic experience. It's the natural house of Sagittarius. So it is the house that comes after Scorpio. And if you've been listening to me, you hear that in Scorpio you approach a fusion, a nucleus. I like to think of it as the relationship that two nuclei, from the sperm cell and the ovum, their nuclei come together, and literature tells you that they fuse together. Well, that's not exactly true. They don't actually fuse together. They rearrange themselves into a new type of organization, despite the fact that they seem to remain separate. And a new human being comes from the connections that form between one set of chromosomes and the other set of chromosomes. They are united in some sense with some microtubules. Bridge the gap between them so that they now look as if they have fused together. Okay? But that's really what happens in Scorpio. It's not like the two people disappear. No, they come into a new type of organization whereby the connections between them are so solid and powerful, they appear as one thing. And a new reality begins to grow from there. Well, that new reality is Sagittarius because of the way that it grows. It's a space that is expanding at a very rapid rate and is expanding in your head because that depth of connection that you find in Scorpio, it really is a touching of knowledge. And what happens when your mind receives knowledge, when you're able to receive a certain type of knowledge, then the implications of that knowledge, they begin to multiply in your head. That is the Sagittarian space. And what it does is that it allows the human being to expand their mind to a point where they can begin to see the possibility of Capricorn. But that's not all. The Capricornian journey is very long. It is the Sagittarius that forms the ability to sustain that journey. Without Sagittarius, the Capricornian journey is impossible. Alright? That's really what it is. Now, this plays out very differently for different people. So, but what Pluto does in the area, in that theater of the 9th house, where matters pertaining to Sagittarius are being entertained, is that the knowing effect of that Pluto now goes into this post-orgasmic experience of Sagittarius, where the person wants to know precisely what that orgasmic experience really is. It becomes an obsessive focus. It becomes an obsession. The need to know is not something that can be suppressed anymore. The individual's entire reality will now be patterned around that need to know. So first of all, they will deny that experience. And people have many different ways of denying the experience. They may become fanatics. They may become religious zealots. They may become people who have absolutely no belief whatsoever. People who don't even see the Capricornian journey, because the belief that people talk about really is something that you cultivate on a Capricornian journey because it's long and it's difficult. Okay? But people react in these ways differently. But all these different reactions are typified by the fact that the person is running away. They're running away from the truth of what they are in that ninth house experience. They may be compulsive, obsessive gamblers, obsessive speculators. And these speculations always backfire so as to induce them into a situation where they don't have to deal with that truth about themselves. Do you understand? Ultimately, all the Plutonic activities, whichever way they're being compensated for in the ninth house, they must ultimately trigger the transformation when the time is right. When the person can accept their truth, then reality begins to rearrange itself to the set of circumstances that allow the person to be able to accept what is at the end of that truth. So if they need to suffer before they can accept it, then that's what they're going to see. If they need to have any types of experiences, whatever it is, they call it into existence so that they can create the conditions under which they can now accept that truth. And all of this is taking place unconsciously. It is not something that they're doing with their minds, per se, even though they are doing it. Alright? But there's no ownership for it. It tends to appear as the circumstantial parts of the environment. Okay? Very, very important to note the difference. Pluto in the ninth house means that this person wants to know what sex really is, not just from the point of view of two sexual organs connecting together in deep intimacy. No, it's more than that. They can perceive the nature of this sexuality beyond just the sexual act itself. They know that there's something at the end of this thing and they want to know what that is. They want to know the meaning of life. What is life really? These patterns that you see in nature, these patterns that you see in reality, even within themselves, they just know that somehow there is a structure underneath this and they don't know what that structure is, so they obsess over it. Now, other parts of the natal chart will be talking about something that has to do with this particular obsession that they have. It's always tied to the wider story. But you see, where you have Pluto and Scorpio, the story is always tied on a very foundational level. That's why anything that is connected to these two things, they are fated in some sense. Okay? Because they represent the part of yourself that you control the least. In fact, part of the entire human experience is to learn to appreciate what these things are. So you can bring them out from the subterranean world because they don't want to be there. And you can bring them out closer to the sun. So that the light of the sun and the warmth of the sun can penetrate these things and begin the process of transforming them into life. Imagine what happens if you bring Pluto closer to the sun, like where the earth is. It's an ice ball. It will thaw completely. Okay? Most of the gases that are not good for life, they will blow away into the atmosphere or whatever it is. And what will remain? You'll be surprised. You will find a world just full of water. That's what do you think the Earth looked like 3 billion or 4 billion years ago? All right. So that's really what it is. Now, the ninth house is a very advanced house. In that house, we're dealing with the projections from the third house or the projections from Gemini, whereby in Gemini, we formed intervals that allowed us to get a measure of the type of concept we're talking about. In Sagittarius, we are linking these concepts together into large-scale structures, which we are using to investigate the central question. What is the nature of sex? What is the nature of knowledge? What does it mean when two people are connected together? These questions obsess these people, okay? And they want to know how that sits in the whole of the human experience. But what is the real truth behind this? Pluto in the ninth house. What is the essence of the truth that they originally run away from? The answer always revolves around ambition. You see, there's something taking place in the 10th house or in Capricorn, somewhere in the natal chart, where the individual is absolutely terrified of that narrative. So since Sagittarius or the ninth house is needed before you get to the 10th or before you get to Capricorn, then that's where the individual delays the awareness of that. And so everything they do in that house is to create delays, because the house that is expanding is very vast. In this ninth house, these people will always encounter games around the issue of sex, money, and power. It could even be in institutions. For instance, if they work in academic institutions, their colleagues will try to undermine them. They will try to undermine their ambition. Where you have Pluto is where you must play these games or receive people playing these games against you, because they're not really games. They are measures of how you identify with your own power. And remember, your own power revolves around your own truth. Now, when you get confused, you're not able to play these games. You don't know how to posture or position yourself. So you become a recipient for other people's control, other people's manipulation, and other people's oppression. Pluto in the 9th house also suggests a tendency for your climb to be sabotaged, even in the religious space. The tendency is always towards religious dogmatism, fanaticism, and people taking control over your reality in that sense. Pluto in the 9th house always suggests that on foreign trips you should also be very careful because you could be swindled. There is always the Plutonic essence in anything that has to do with the 9th house, including publishing, deals that revolve around labels, record labels, writing contracts, etc. People will always try to undermine you. You can think of it this way, that the way that you position yourself, not being able to receive your own power and to sit it, you basically invite people to attempt, to try. And the reason why you do that is to remind yourself of what your own power is, indirectly. One of these games ultimately leads to the transformation that allows the person to be better able to receive their own power and to sit it. Imagine climbing up a mountain, and the peak of the mountain is what Capricorn is. The climb itself is what you experience as Sagittarius. Now you would say, oh, but it's the house of Jupiter. How does it work? Well, if it were the house of something else, then that journey would be totally impossible. Because despite what everybody tells you, everybody's success has often depended on some things that they call luck. Some compensation somewhere that helped you and aided you on your journey. Otherwise, the whole thing is literally impossible. Okay? So people tend to transform in those types of journeys because you get to encounter many aspects of yourself. It's not an easy journey if you have an ambition that is so powerful and it draws you in. The journey towards the realization of that ambition is never an easy thing. But most of the journey itself takes place through that 9th house in Sagittarius. And you have to develop a faith in life to be able to get through. You have to have some type of thing that gives you the ability to continue to envision and then to be able to move towards that envisioning in a real, tangible way. You need to have access to the knowledge of how to realize and build your ambition. Otherwise, where are you going? And that type of knowledge resides in Sagittarius or the 9th house. Okay, so the stories woven into this house, they are talking about this type of awareness that allows a person to make a choice that is based on knowledge. And I've once talked about how the seed for this process it really starts in the sign of Cancer, where the convictions are laid. The convictions are the things that give you the notion that the ambition in Capricorn or in the 10th house, that they're realizable. And then that starts off your journey through Leo. But by the time you get to Sagittarius, you're on the verge, would you say, of achieving your dreams. Now you just need to make the right choices regarding the right type of knowledge. The knowledge of how to. You're going to make choices in these areas because the space is expanding and it is very easy to get lost. It is very easy to begin to wander aimlessly in various non-positive directions in some sense, even though altogether it all adds up at the end of the day. Okay? But if you have a map that tells you how to choose in this area, which is a story that is written not just in the 9th house, but all over your natal chart, then your realization of Capricorn or the 10th house ambition becomes, a less painful experience. That's really what it is. So initially the choices are delayed or they're abandoned in some sense because there's a terrible fear about that Pluto that is sitting in the 9th house. It is so frightening that the individual buries that aspect of their reality. Alright? They remove it from view, so to speak, and then the pressure begins to build from the subterranean. And if the narrative is powerful enough in the life story, it will erupt at some point in time during some type of transit that you will have. And that transit will expose you in the sense that you do not have access to the types of knowledge that allow you to reconstruct your ambition as a reality. You become aware of, the fact that maybe if you have needed to go to higher education or something to develop a set of ideas into a region where you can now use them as the framework for building and realizing your ambition, you realize that those things are missing. This is what the transformation is all about. And it represents a rebirth of the person, it's a rebirth of the motive, so that you are now more consciously aware of how you are sabotaging your own power because you are afraid. Because you are afraid of success. Okay? But if the transformation is happening at a time where you can still recover, you can go to school, you can travel, expand your mind, because that's exactly what it is. You see, the 9th house, the antithesis of the 9th house is dogmatism. It's a kind of faith system that has no roots in knowledge. And there is nothing like that, because at the core sits the absolute form of knowledge. So how then can its journey be one of ignorance? It's impossible. You see, a lot of people talk about blind faith. You have to have faith in this and that. They don't know what they're talking about, because every aspect of this reality, it grows from absolute knowledge. And do you know what absolute knowledge is? That's why I call it a core. It's something that doesn't move and it doesn't change. It's something whose truth does not get questioned. Not because nobody can question it, because what is the point? Its truth is so obvious. It will always remain obvious. So you encounter that in another person if you can achieve the level of relationship that takes. You encounter what feels like a core, because you as a human being, what makes you unique and special is that you have the ability to feel like a core, and you're just made of flesh and blood. Okay? And so when two people find themselves in a situation where they can activate each other's core, whereby they collapse to the very central nature of what their own existence is supposed to be, well, what grows out of that can only be knowledge. Well, it's abstract knowledge, but it's not unreachable knowledge. No, it's a precise mathematical knowledge. Even though that's not how you experience it, because the way that your body is processing this mathematics, it appears as this sexual thing. Okay? But what it is really something more pristine than that. You can call it the gates of Eden, the entry point back into paradise. Because what you call the exit from paradise, there's really no exit. There's just the dimness of awareness, where everybody's mind it appears as if you are in a fog. Okay, you can't really see the connections. Meanwhile, there's a trillion other connections. Now, people who can see many more connections, who can feel many more connections, they find it very difficult to function in this world as it is right now, because they're gonna appear very crazy. They can't live amongst people. They cannot live the way other people live. Alright? And these connections exist as very high lights. In fact, Pluto and Neptune, they're literally talking about some of the highest possible lights. By the time you even get to Neptune, the light is that is the awareness of the connections is so high. It's super fine. So if you cannot match the super fineness or hyper fineness in those areas, then you miss all the narratives that it unlocks. Because when you have Neptune in your natal chart, you've built the ability to be hyper fine in sensitivity in those areas. Because what is required there is for you to raise that vibration to the very highest. Okay? That's where you can experience the most beautiful things. Your challenge in that area is to make sure that those beautiful things are true. Because if they're not, then Neptune can deliver to you illusion. You see that really, it's all an assessment. The life story is just like an assessment. And what is being assessed is your ability to know. But what are you knowing really? In the end, what are you knowing? You are knowing the nature of what you are, where you come from. That's the story that you're telling. It's the sum total of all the stories that you're telling. And the nucleus of that story really is the type of love stories that are true, that you will make in your life. That's it.